Welcome everyone to the webinar on approaches to software licensing. I'm Mark Singer of OUP, and I'll be your moderator today. Our discussion will center around the challenges that TTOs face when licensing software-based technologies to startups, and the novel solutions some universities have established to address these challenges through the implementation of simple software licenses and other non-traditional software agreements. Let's start off by getting to know our panelists who will be discussing their software IP programs. I'll have each of them provide a brief introduction of themselves. So first we'll start with Drew Bennett of Michigan.
Thanks, Mark. This is Drew Bennett. I'm with the University of Michigan Tech Transfer team, and I've been here at Michigan for a little over 6 years. Prior to coming to Michigan, I probably had what I would guess is a pretty traditional startup background in the software industry. I was in several different startups and a variety of engineering and product management positions, and then came to the university 6 years ago, and have really enjoyed working within the academic research and licensing field.
Great, and now we also have Mike Cohen of Berkeley. So Mike, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good morning from the West Coast. At UC Berkeley, I do full stack IP management and licensing across the full spectrum of technologies from information technology to biotech. I also work to develop the campus's innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem through developing accelerators and other programs that help entrepreneurs and startups commercialize the technology developed on the campus.
Great, well, welcome to both of you. And here at OUP, we have very long-standing partnerships with both Michigan and Berkeley. We've invested in many startups out of each of those respective institutions, and I've worked closely with both Drew and Mike and have found them to be kind of creative and innovative as they think about solving different licensing-related challenges. And first, again, I'll talk about how we got here to begin with. So for those of you who know us well, our goal is to track all of the startup activity out of all of our partner universities. And some of those startups are software oriented. And we found a different dynamic with software spinouts than we did with hardware spinouts or life science spinouts, in that of the software companies we were tracking, a high percentage of them were not licensing technology from the university, even though it was clear to us, at least, that they were based on research at the university. And so these pie charts show some data from OUP's internal database, where we rate all of the companies by quality. So what we did is isolate what we consider our top quality companies, our A quality companies that are software companies. And then we looked at how many of them are licensing, have an active license from the university, and how many never licensed anything from the university. And if you look at the A quality software companies that we are tracking, about 72% had no license, about 200 companies, and 28% did have a license. So the vast majority of these companies were not licensing from the university. And then on the right side, we also looked at how much capital they'd raised and whether it the presence of a license or not impacted the amount of capital they raised. And you see the same ratio of capital raised among the startups that have not licensed from the university as those that have. So it's neither kind of the license appears to be neither kind of a hindrance nor a promoter of their ability to raise capital. On average, they're raising the same amount of capital. So, our focus was on those companies not licensing from the university and trying to go deeper and understand why. And so we started kind of cataloging our own experience in this. And kind of we'll talk you through what we've seen, but then after this, I'd also like Mike and Drew to just pitch in if there's anything here that you think we're missing or any kind of particular areas you've seen at your respective universities. So there really have been three main reasons we've seen that software companies have chosen to avoid licensing. The first is a general belief that they don't need a license. And number one, it could be that there's nothing patented or they don't value any patents that exist at the university. And it could be that they've written some code at the university but expect they'll rewrite it in a short period of time, so they don't need access to the original code. Or the third is that they believe that the software was developed not using traditional university resources, so this falls outside of the IP policy, and that they legitimately don't need a license, and sometimes they're right about that. So that's been kind of the number one reason they feel fairly strongly they don't need a license. The second has been that they prefer to go the open source route. And one of the things that's changed here over the last several years is that open source has become a marketing strategy for software companies. So it used to be that open source was more of a philosophical choice by developers who thought all software should be open source. And increasingly, lots of startups and large companies have found that open source is a great way to generate leads, to get customers starting to use a base level of software where they can then sell a proprietary version of that or improvements. And so open source as a business strategy has grown quite significantly. And so there they have, they don't need a license. And then the third area has been that working with software entrepreneurs have found that working with the tech transfer office is too difficult. And I would include computer science professors in that statement. So we found that they often have kind of a mindset that that the compensation or the economics of the license are too high relative to what they're licensing. Sometimes we hear comments that the tech transfer office is using life science terms applied to software deals, and in particular around the presence of a royalty in deals. So the vast majority of the software world does not experience royalties in any regard. So the idea of entertaining a royalty, sometimes they can have a negative reaction to. And then the third is that sometimes we've heard that they would license if they knew they could get it done, but they're hesitant to engage because they're worried it's going to be a long, protracted process and they don't know if they'll be successful in the end. So those are the reasons when we isolate the companies that chose not to license, those are the things we are hearing from them. So these aren't our opinions, these are the opinions of entrepreneurs and computer science professors and departments. And those are the things that were on our mind as we started to think about novel ways to get around some of this and increase the number of software licenses. So let me pause there. Drew and Mike, do you have any thoughts on any of this? Does this match your experience? It'd be great just to hear your reaction.
Well, at Berkeley, I think you have very accurately articulated the breadth and depth of the situation, and including all the nuances like the expected friction and also the benefits now of going to market with an open source software strategy. So I have nothing else to add.
Yeah, I would agree with you with that comment, Mark. I think part of the other thing, if you do the proverbial customer discovery, is it's kind of perception versus reality. None of what's on there has to actually be true, but if people believe it to be true, you're in the same place. So I think some portion of it's really just trying to, I guess, more aggressively market what your actual practice is and how your office works with the field.
Okay, great. So then kind of taking all this feedback, we started working with a number of universities, which includes Michigan and Berkeley and some others around. What are different ways to try to solve this problem? And so we started saying, can you kind of rethink how you approach software licensing altogether to address these? And originally our thinking was kind of on the left side here around a simple software license. Could you build a license that allowed you to actually have more startups that were going out the back door choose to license? So creating an incentive rather than a stick around this, with the benefit that the university itself could have more licenses and which would have an economic benefit and also kind of a reputational benefit. They could collaborate with these groups and claim credit for it. But part of the trade-off would be to reduce the economics and simplify the license. So the idea was to have reduced economics in more spinouts as opposed to higher economics in fewer spinouts. And then, the benefit to startups would be that they could also get clarity around IP ownership, which sometimes the investor community wants, although we've been surprised here that more of the investment community does not insist on that, but also that acquirers want. And so so our approach was, can you find some crossing point where you lower the economics in the agreement and make the agreement easier? So more startups will want to do it simply so they could clarify their IP ownership and also be proud of the university affiliation, participate in university programs around it, and have a quick deal get done. So that was our thinking, and it was originally focused on the simple software license, which we'll talk about first. Then Mike kind of took this one step further to figure out how to where to go with open source agreements. And then, so to drill out on the simple software license, about 3 to 4 years ago, after some discussions around this, Columbia University made the first step forward, which was a very significant step forward, where they developed a simple software license for their own purposes, but were also kind enough to share it with anybody who was interested in it. And that license was designed to do what the kinds of things we discussed: it reduce the economics, so Columbia would take lower equity, no royalty, and simplify the license itself. And then that first effort by Columbia was then followed by a great effort by Michigan, and then a number of other universities mentioned here who have either rolled programs out or are testing programs now. And so I would say we're still in the early stages of this, and we'll talk a little bit later about what we've learned so far around how this will all work. I would say now, and we may come back to this later, there's been some question about, as you do this, what are you actually licensing? Are you licensing code? Are you licensing patents? And different universities have approached that differently. And we'll probably talk about that a little bit. So with that, I don't think we have any questions so far. So I'm going to turn it over to Drew to talk about Michigan Simple Software License.
Thanks, Mark. Just have a handful of slides here, really trying to set a little bit of the background as to how we arrived at starting with what Mark has described at the broad level, and then some things I would encourage people just, I guess, broadly to think about and try to relate to their own situation and understand whether these things resonate or not. And I think that becomes important when you contemplate whether you're interested in doing this yourself. I've had the good fortune of being mentored and working with some folks inside of tech transfer that really, I think, were involved with the establishment of tech transfer as a practice. And we often think about the backdrop, if you will, in terms of kind of the history of tech transfer, with those segments kind of being split, as you see on the slide, in the sense that initially, I think there was a lot of activity and certainly software falling within this, where, you know, you're attempting to establish practice and then moving through a period of kind of setting benchmarks for people about what would be expected in terms of the mechanics and financials of an arrangement. And kind of maybe we've gotten to the back end of that second phase, and we really look at it as saying, kind of, what do you need to do to extend and evolve participation of people specifically out of the CS group in 2020 and beyond, and obviously maybe a little bit before that, in order to engage them and get participation. So really kind of in the day and age where there's such significant interest on the startup side, and a lot of interest even from the bigger players in saying, you know what, that's interesting technology. If you start a company and they're able to gain traction, we definitely might want to revisit that. And these are things that we've heard and certainly informed us with respect to the background. Specifically, you know, just the basic notion things have changed and you have to adapt and evolve to support those things. And I think secondarily, really trying to understand where the strengths and weaknesses of what the university contributes in these settings becomes really, really important. Certainly, there are a large number of those factors. The list could be very, very, very long, and there are also things in that list where the university just does not provide as much value in the form of production or scaling of things and commercial development. Those just aren't things that, generally speaking, in a software setting are things that the university is going to do with a focus on research and education. And then thinking broadly about the people you're trying to work with, whether that's faculty, whether that's people inside your ecosystem as far as investors or people who are serial entrepreneurs trying to do startups. What are they looking for in the collaboration and the partnership? What are the types of things that they may be interested in getting out of the deal? And what we heard and some of the background that we kind of looked into as part of it, really I would say the overall message was more of a long view and a real deep understanding of the reality of failure for startups in the software space in particular, that a lot of these folks just ultimately the market isn't going to receive the product, the timing's going to be off, something's not going to be right, and they're not going to get anywhere. And that becomes really, really important in the structure of the deal. And the reality, I think, if you reflect on your own experience and the deals that your group may have done over the years, is kind of trying to come to a reality of the deal you may have written originally versus multiple amendments that might have had to been made in order to get that deal or that license to continue to work and be alive and resonate with the startup or the folks who have taken it out. So those are just some things from the background standpoint that, as we've thought about it, became important. So the next slide really kind of is intended to talk about, how we started looking at these things. And we took a review really of kind of our deal history, and deal history in terms of both the deals that we actually did, then what might have happened with respect to amendments or changes that had to be made in order to allow the startup to succeed, try to understand cases where you were maybe not as flexible and tried to get people really to commit to things that they had signed up for and try to understand their success, trying to evaluate in certain cases, had you taken an equity position early in the company and the company exited, would you have been better off than a traditional royalty type of arrangement, and doing a little bit of scenario or gaming of that to try and understand what those potential impacts could have been. And then I think something that's been mentioned a little bit earlier is really trying to track and acknowledge and really understand in the case of things that are backdoor type of issues or things where you didn't get to be involved, what happened there? What were the particular aspects of those deals and agreements, so that you can understand where you maybe fell short. And that gets into the basic discussion with the partners, whether that be the faculty themselves, whether that be the investment community or just general licensees. What were the things that they found good, bad, or indifferent, or what would be good, bad, or indifferent with respect to a new form or structure of a license, going specifically to the equity-based license or equity-only licenses, and really having a pretty direct and frank conversation with them about what that looks like. We did a lot of this with our community to try and understand what those type of things might include, kind of what the dimensions of what's fair, what's reasonable, and what would work, and trying to get a good understanding of that, and then putting forward a bit of a straw model, if you will, that says, hey, if we did things like X, are these types of things that you would be more willing to sign up for, that you'd be willing to participate in, and try to understand those pieces. And then I think really all those things have to be layered on top of the individual technology or the IP that you're talking about, the maturity of it, how much you've invested in it with respect to the grant history or other things relative to it, how really unique is it, and in what settings will it make sense? Do you have a lot of IP wrapped up in it? Do you have a significant patent portfolio? Is it simply something that's copyrighted? Is it really something that's only a know-how type of activity, and trying to layer all that stuff together inside of the notion of what that simple license looks like. And finally, you just have to get the right people on board with it. At least from our point of view, this has been important, and that's the inventors certainly themselves, the leadership of departments or deans of colleges, and then the ecosystem with respect to the local investors. I think, we probably have a bit of a hang up in the Midwest from the standpoint of flyover country. We kind of have to try harder. So what are the things that we can do? Certainly was not left completely on the sidelines to try and continue to attract interest and participation with our office. So the last slide really is probably the part that most people are particularly interested in, is kind of what have you done? So our simple structure, we've done about 20 licenses to date. We would consider 8 of these incremental, and incremental in the sense that they may not have happened had we not put this structure together. But our equity level really scales between 1% to 5%, and that thing is based on an initial raise threshold amount, and it's been as low as $500,000 and up to $5 million on the anti-dilution side of it. They're all negotiated on a deal-by-deal basis, and we attempt to try and bring in all the things that I just mentioned with respect to what works and what doesn't work. Try to bring some additional things with it, and I would tell you, there's a number of programs that we have and a number of things, whether it's association with the brand, helping to have people really have a quick, speedy, efficient, low-friction type of experience, whether it's connecting people into the venture community fabric here in our region. But ultimately, I think one of the key drivers to why this is successful for us is really trying to create a positive environment with a lot of goodwill, where people are actually encouraging participation and bringing people into the fold, if you will, with respect to engaging with our office. And that's worked out really, really well. So putting that as a high priority item has been very important. And the last thing that I would kind of add is, it isn't for everything. I think you kind of have to think about some things in advance, kind of know what you are willing to do or not do, types of ranges that you would do, categories of things that you would be willing to do or not do. I think you have to do a lot of work to educate the ecosystem and make sure that they understand kind of what your thinking is and how it's going to work. I think having really strong and valuable milestones becomes a really big part of this discussion when you're going to go to an equity-only deal, because that's the strongest lever you have if there's a situation where you have to get out of the agreement. And then lastly, of course, is all the things I mentioned earlier, which are really just kind of understanding what you have and what the value is and scaling it accordingly. So with that, I will pass it over to Mike.
And Drew, but Mike, before we go to you, we got a number of excellent questions around simple software licenses in particular. So maybe we'll go ahead and take some of those now. One or two, Mike, I might have you also answer once you presented Berkeley's open source approach. But why don't we try to go through a few of them now, and Drew, if you could answer from Michigan's perspective about its software license, and then I can also answer what I know from what other universities are doing. So one, which relates to kind of what you just said, is kind of what are you licensing? And in particular, is Michigan using the simple software license where patents have been filed?
We have done that, yes. There have been agreements where patents are part of it.
Okay, and I would say there are different answers for different universities. So Columbia's answer, I believe, the last time I checked in, was this explicitly did not include patented software. And part of the reason I know it is because of a spirited discussion we had originally around this, where we at OUP were taking kind of the market perspective on this, of what is the market expecting in terms of VCs, entrepreneurs, and our point was that we don't think the market in software really values patents that much. So from the market side, they don't really care. They would want the same agreement whether there are patents or not. And some universities have taken that approach. Other university and the simple software license includes patented deals, including Michigan. Other universities have said, no, if there's a patent, it goes through the traditional licensing process because we've invested a lot more capital in securing the patents. And so it goes through the traditional process.
I think part of what goes with that too, Mark, and it's the question that usually follows right onto it is, well, what happens with the expense? And there's really a number of ways you can go about it. We've had situations where upon exit, that those payments are repaid. We'd have situations where the equity number is modified slightly to accommodate for the costs associated with that. So it's not necessarily a situation, I would want to be clear, that says you're not actually going to recoup those investments. You just may get them on through a different mechanism or at a different timing.
Okay. Great. And then there are a number of questions around kind of the equity amount itself and also anti-dilution. So how do you decide? You have a range. So how do you decide on the amounts, both of equity and anti-dilution going into a specific deal?
So from our standpoint, the equity amount really goes into trying to evaluate what is it. If you're putting something out, as you might imagine, that's fairly light, that's a little bit of copyright, maybe some know-how, a small amount of code, then the equity percentage is going to reflect that. Different than a situation where you have multiple inventions, potentially patents, a longer history, there's just deeper investment from the university side. Those we're going to ask for a slightly higher equity percentage, and that's really kind of the general dynamic that we're trying to measure it under. Lightweight, trying to make sure you have a relationship and that there's a dialogue there. You're going to have to adjust your expectations accordingly. But if you're going with something that's got a significant portfolio behind it, you should have a reasonable expectation that your equity position reflects that.
Okay. And then I would say to kind of add what other universities have done, some universities have been much more fixed about this, like a fixed number. I believe the last time I checked in, like Columbia's fixed number was 2% equity. And it did not change, again, knowing that it did not include patented software. We at OUP, reflecting the market side, have been advocating a fixed number. So it was clear what it is. It was also clear that it was a small number. And so everybody knew going in that it was a reasonable number and the likelihood of success of kind of executing the agreement would be clear. But we've seen ranges, general ranges. Michigan goes a little higher on the higher end. The general range we've seen on equity is 1% to 2%. And then on the anti-dilution side for others outside of Michigan, I think those are range from no anti-dilution to a couple $1 million generally on what we've seen on the anti-dilution side. And then just to be, there was a question or two, Drew, on kind of your bullet point of that says economics negotiated on a deal-by-deal basis, and a couple questions about what are you negotiating. To be clear, that's only around the equity amount in the anti-dilution, right? There aren't other economics in the license besides equity and anti-dilution. Is that accurate?
Yeah, those are the two pieces that we're having a conversation about.
Yeah, and then the licenses we've seen from other universities that do not have milestone payments, and most importantly, don't have royalties. And that's really, in some sense, kind of the big if. So if you look at OUP's license database, so as hopefully all of you know, we have a license database of over 1,000 startup licenses that tracks the economics of licenses that can be a resource for our partners as they're doing licenses. If you look in the OUP database around software licenses, a large percentage of software deals have royalties today. And it's the presence of the royalty that has often been kind of the biggest kind of piece that drives kind of negative emotions on the other side. And so the dropping of the royalty, we think is really important. Then there was also a question about use of name, which was a bullet point in the OUP previous slide. And Drew, I'm not sure how much you talked about it. So talk about how do you approach the use of the Michigan name in a simple software license?
Yeah, we've had agreement we call Powered by Michigan Technology, which is a set of brand assets that have been developed by our creative group, which is essentially part of the structure of the deal. And essentially, it allows the company to make that association with the Michigan brand in a very specific way, in a brand presentation that we're really kind of setting the standard as to how that's done. So it's a bit of an Intel Inside type of thing, but that's the structure that we have. We think it's important. We want the company to certainly associate with the brand, but we want to have some management or control, if you will, as to how that's done, and that's the mechanism that we do that. So a lot of people certainly want to have that affiliation with with the university that it came out of, and we do that as part of pretty much all of these agreements.
And I would say that's generally consistent with what we've seen elsewhere. So we at OUP, in some sense, we're trying to push some of the initial universities a little bit more strongly. Let the startups that are signing simple software licenses kind of use the name aggressively to promote the university affiliation, and it's better for everybody, and it's a great incentive for startups to want to sign the license. I would say we got some pushback on that, and basically most universities seem to revert to the same use of name policies that they do in their traditional licenses. And so whatever has been in the traditional licensing side, that's how they've done it here. So there are a lot of questions and some really good ones, and we're going to try to get to all of them, but I might suggest we transition over to Mike Cohen so you can talk about your approach to open source agreements, and then we'll come back and try to hit as many of the questions as we can. So
okay, there we go. Thank you. For continuity, I'm going to riff off of Drew's opening statement that the world has been changing, and I'm lucky enough to work in an office and in a campus where there's this acknowledgement that the universities have to change as well, and there's a lot of discussion about what is the 21st century university like. And within that culture, there's this also openness to experimenting with new things, trying things, piloting new programs. And so in that context, one of the things that we've observed at UC Berkeley, and this is true also at other research universities, is that there's huge value and wealth created from university spinouts that leverage software developed at and open source by universities. And on this slide, you can see a short list of some of those spinouts from UC Berkeley. And in aggregate, there's billions of dollars in wealth created here. And I'll just echo Mark's slide at the beginning, which said that, observed that there was about $5 billion in money raised by these open source software companies that don't have licenses with universities. So next slide. So we asked ourselves, the challenge is, how can universities like UC Berkeley contractually obtain just a fraction of some of that wealth created by those open source software startups, which I'll now refer to as OS3 companies, and to take some of that fraction of wealth and fund university research education, in particular university research education that then creates more open source software companies and value. So with that challenge in mind, next slide. We then talked to a lot of people, and from the founders, OS3 founders and VCs, particularly OUP, they started to tell us kind of informally that if the university had a simple equity agreement, then many of these OS3 companies would execute it. And concurrently, we also heard from some founders, OS3 founders, that it would be ideal if they had a letter from the university that helped de-risk the possibility of future IP conflicts with the university around open source and also some public domain technology. So, and they wanted these letters from our Office of Technology License that said the university read open source software and the company didn't steal anything from the university. So we started hearing that kind of feedback, and next slide. We started again brainstorm on transactions or agreements that could be a win-win for both the university and these OS3 companies. And so on this slide, on the x-axis, we have the value of some kind of agreement with the value to startups. And one of the thresholds that I want to point out here in this x-axis is the point at which what the university is providing is considered consideration from the university to the startup. Because as we started to work with our attorneys, they were very adamant, of course, that any kind of agreement had to have consideration from both parties to make the agreement valid. Then on the y-axis, we looked at issues with risk to the university. And one threshold there on this y-axis that you'll see is, at some point, this kind of agreement could become an endorsement by the university of the startup and its products, and we didn't want to pass that threshold. So within this landscape, we looked at, in general, three types of agreements. I'm simplifying a bit, but on the one end of the continuum was this, we call it a goodwill acknowledgement. And that stated that the university confers goodwill on the startup and monitors what it's doing, it praises its mission, and values a friendly relationship. Then on the other end of the continuum, we had this draft of an agreement that just stated that the university agreed to open source the software. And then in the middle, we had something called a good standing agreement, and that stated that as of the date of the agreement, the OS3 company was in good standing because the university agreed to open source the software. So that was the continuum, and we thought that the open source acknowledgement was not enough value because it really didn't state anything more than often what was in a research agreement. And on the other end of the continuum, we thought the goodwill agreement was too much of a university endorsement. So we started to dig in then on this middle layer, this so-called good standing acknowledgement. Next slide. So here's how we structured it to be a win-win, and some of the structures also key optics. And when I talk about this with faculty, and particularly the labs that have a strong spirit of open source software, the first thing I say about the key attributes is, number one, it's optional. Number two, there's no cache. And number three, it's quick and easy. And I just, those statements, those three statements first, put people at ease now. And then I had to mention a key point about consideration from both parties, but the university can't endorse. And then we started to structure a written statement that could be valuable to the startups, the statement in writing that they could show potential investors and strategic partners and key customers that the university agreed to open source the software, the startup is in good standing with the university at the time of the agreement, and also acknowledgement that the university fostered the development of the software and the spin-out. So, and then the financial terms, we also tried to get a lot of feedback from faculty who are entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs spinning out of the campus, VCs like OUP and so forth. And where we came out with something that we thought was very simple again, 1% of the newly incorporated startup stock. So the idea is that this transaction, this agreement would occur at the onset of the company spinning out of the university. So 1% is not necessarily a lot at that time. It's often maybe even some of the, before even any kind of real funding comes through. So it's, that's at the onset, subject to a lot of dilution. And then the key thing that we wanted here was the participation rights in future investments. And there again, we tried to structure, well, how much can we take? And we thought, well, if we could get 1%, up to 1% of our initial ownership, then that could be a pretty big win if we have some of these OS3 companies that become unicorns in some of their subsequent rounds. And then the other thing we wanted to mention is that any income would be evenly split with the open source software lab, the department like the ECS, the unit like the College of Engineering, and then of course the campus. And in order, we wanted everyone to be like for this and to be, again, not only a win-win for the university and the startup in general, but a win-win across the campus. And so that's the solution we came up with. Next slide. So here's the status. First, I have to emphasize that we didn't want to alienate the strong open source community at UC Berkeley. And I have a little email here from the Vice Chancellor of Research as he's agreeing for us to experiment with this. He says, and he's a CS professor from ECS, says faculty in the ECS will be very protective of the purity of open source as a research publication tech development model. And basically he's saying, don't screw this up. And so, so that's why this was kind of soft pedaled, kind of a soft introduction. And I was pleased, like several weeks ago, I presented to the faculty directors of one of the big new open source software labs called Berkeley AI Research. And they have this big open commons model for the software. And some of these professors could be cantankerous, but I was pleased that they were very friendly and they saw this as a potentially win-win because, of course, these departments are struggling with funding and everything, and they see the wealth creation from these OS3 companies, and it'd be nice if some of it came back again in a win-win. So now we're poised to execute 3 OS3 good standing agreements. I tried to get one over the line for this webinar, but maybe later today. But coincidentally, that one that's the most mature is with a startup that was co-founded by a faculty director who is one of the faculty directors and founders of that Berkeley AI Research Lab, as well as something called Berkeley Deep Drive, another large open source software lab. And so I think it's very key that that person is one of the first to use this agreement as part of their spin-out. And so we hope that that kind of role modeling will help make this agreement eventually just part of the standard culture at UC Berkeley, where when OS3 companies are spinning out, they just automatically do the OS3 agreement, and it's very simple and win-win. And where our goal is, maybe over the course of the next few years, we might get participation rights in maybe 3 or 5 of these OS3 companies, and maybe if 1 or 2 of them become unicorns, that we might have maybe participation rights worth over $10 million that we can then spread around the campus. And one other point I want to make is that in discussing these real opportunities with these startups, the opportunities span this not just to open source software, but also to intellectual property that the universally public domain, because some faculty just chose to publish and disclose, but now they're spinning out a company based on the public domain software. And this agreement with some tweaks can be used for public domain software and even software that the university disclaimed, but still the spin out wants to make this a win-win relationship. So that there is some upside in this, where this is going. And I believe that is a summary of the open source software agreement. That's the last slide, right?
Yeah, that is the last slide.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. And that's, you know, from our reaction and from just talking to Mike and seeing the community, it feels like part of the open receptivity to it is that the economic ask is so modest that, you know, you tried to find a point that it almost felt like a no-brainer because you were asking for just something very small.
Correct. And then there again, if the company is successful, then maybe the big win is not those modest 1% upfront equity, but the participation rights up to 1% of the company, you know, like in a Series C or D round, and that could be very valuable to the university and also its partners like OUP.
Great. And on that, there were a couple of questions specifically about participation rights, so maybe we'll try to address those now. So to be clear, Mike, the way your language works, it's 1% of each future round. The participation right allows Berkeley or its partner to buy 1% of each future round. Is that right?
Well, actually, first of all, we use the OUP template. And the way, the intent of the language, which could be subject to argument in the future when there's a lot of money on the table, is that, no, we can get up to 1% of, if accessible, 1% of the company again, as was our initial ownership. And so that could be a lot in a highly valued company. But, you know, going back to the risk of this, the university, some of our attorneys said, well, you know, first of all, we don't want to bully ourselves onto any cap table, and you know, when there's a lot of money involved, there could be people pushing back, and so maybe we'll have to moderate this. But the way it's the spirit of the way it's written is 1% of the company, not just 1% of the round.
And Drew, how have you handled participation rights in Michigan's licenses? In the simple software license.
Yeah, we've started with the templated OUP language as well, and with the traditional ask of the 10% participation rights. And I would say that, you know, the negotiation or people wanting to change those things is really fundamentally no different than we would experience with other licenses where we're asking for participation rights. So it's, you know, sometimes it changes. Sometimes people understand and value that that's a funding opportunity and a good thing for them. So it's not been a huge amount of pushback on the participation side.
Okay. And to answer another question, both cases, in your case also Michigan, it continues through the private financing rounds, right?
Yes.
Like people have asked, when does it end? So it ends at an exit. Okay.
Correct.
Mark, I want to add one more point about participation rights. There was some founders and faculty pushed back a little bit on this notion, but one thing that we did that was very persuasive is we showed them a link on the Stanford University website where participation rights are part of the license and they're not negotiable. And so that kind of sets up some credibility that this is not something outrageous that we're asking for. It's been done by Stanford for many years, and that's down to just the standard operating practice.
Great. And then there was a question, and maybe it's worth just taking a minute. We got to have a whole different webinar on this, of what are the benefits of open sourcing software versus not open sourcing it and licensing back from the university. If an academic came to either of you and asked you whether they should open source or not, how would you guide them to think about it?
Well, open source is now not, it's really more of a known business model. In fact, I believe OUP had a webinar on this that concretized this concept in my mind, that open source now in the software world is a way to get a community and a go-to market strategy without having the startup having to invest in that. And when the startup actually spins out, they kind of come into an existing community of users, and that's the power now of open sourcing in terms of the success of the commercialization. So if you have the mindset is first and foremost, you want to be successful with commercialization, get this out as broad and fast as possible to benefit the the public, then when you have a certain type of software like enterprise software, that can be open source is the best model. So the nuances of what's kind of best for the university are overshadowed by what's best for the success of the technology. And if the university can ride that coattail, it's better than the university trying to optimize. It's like getting a smaller piece of a bigger pie. And so the first thing that I would say is, well, let's talk about how the software is used by customers, and if open sourcing would help drive that success.
Right. And I would say that's consistent with how we guide people, and kind of the way I always think about it is with open source, you can get to market more inexpensively and use the community and get more adoption. But what you also do is effectively reduce your pricing because it's not proprietary software. So there's a limit in how much you can charge when you're dealing with kind of a forked open source program or providing service on top. So you need to make sure you can drive major adoption. And as a result, you'll have more users with at a lower pricing per user. And that's very much the trade-off that we see. We did have a bunch of questions around simple software licenses and whether they're exclusive or not, and also kind of what exactly you're licensing. So Drew, are all of your licenses exclusive?
The overwhelming majority of them are. I did not do all 20 of those, so my answer is going to be provisionally yes. I mean, I'm pretty sure that every one of those has been exclusive. And with respect to what we are licensing, it's kind of back to some of the slides that I put forward. It's a continuum of things. Sometimes it is a simple copyright, small piece of code that people are taking. Sometimes that's in combination with a little bit of know-how, and sometimes it's a much more evolved project that does have patent around it. We've kind of looked at this as running a pretty substantial experiment and seeing, what types of things we can do, where is it going to fit, what types of dialogue are we going to have during those negotiations, and that's been really helpful for us to try and understand people's point of view about those things and not paint it into a box that says it's only X. There's certainly benefits to the, off the shelf, it's X and it's nothing else, and this is the way it works, and we may get there eventually, but there's certainly a way to draw in a broader discussion and a bigger crowd when you say you're willing to, open it up to a little bit broader continuum. Again, in our particular case, we've really focused this in on software, and I think that was another one of those questions. How do you try to avoid having it move into other areas or bleed over into other verticals and things of that nature. And this really gets back to the dialogue with your community and being really, really clear. This is what we're going to use it for. These are the kind of the box that we're trying to at least start with. And I think that becomes very, very important. And people respect that who are trying to work within this kind of setup as far as our experience goes.
Okay, great. And Mike, because I know kind of exclusivity doesn't make sense in the context of your agreements, talk about that second question that Drew just brought up. Have you found any non-software oriented PIs or entrepreneurs who are licensing from the university want the same economics as are in the good standing agreement for an actual license?
We haven't found that yet, although this is still the very early days. I did mention that there are opportunities to apply this to IP that's been public domained because we didn't file patents, as well as IP that we've just kind of disclaimed or waived, but that's all speculative. So I don't know, but like I say, it hasn't been applied to anything that we've patented yet. And we're not contemplating going in that direction. I mean, really, this has been optimized for open source software agreements.
Yeah, and I would say that the question of how do you control this and limit it to software, and so it doesn't lead into other sectors, so all of a sudden you have a therapeutics company wanting the same economics and no royalty, is like a highly relevant question, and every university we've seen go through the exploration of some type of software agreement has been worried about it. It seems to be so far that it has not been an issue, and the key, as both Mike and Drew said, is kind of clearly defining what this is for and what it's not for, and drawing that line. It's when it's blurry that I think conflicts can arise, but we have not seen it yet. So we've not seen any kind of cannibalization or erosion of non-software licensing terms because of any software-related agreements.
Yeah, I would also add one interesting nuance here, but it's very definitive, is that the open source software good standing agreement is not a license agreement. And so because of that, there's maybe less worry about these terms bleeding into a real license agreement, because in our context, the license agreement is the open source software license, like BSD or something. And so, again, we're not as concerned about the bleeding, but I can understand with the simple software license how people might want to use that as a reference point.
Yeah. And then there are another series of questions around kind of future improvements, which again would be more relevant for a traditional software license. So Drew, how do you handle future improvements in your licenses?
Yeah, the licenses for what exists at the time the agreement is executed. So certainly the licensee may look like the ideal future target for improvements, and they're probably going to be the person you may work with first. But those extensions, generally speaking, are going to be handled separately. So we do not have clauses that are trying to cover off on improvements by the PI later on. We would come back and address that at that time. Okay.
And then how have both of you found the negotiation process so far? And Mike, maybe you could start because you're in the thick of it right now. Is the license non-negotiable or is it negotiable? And has that been better than a traditional license? Sorry, I refer to it as a license rather than an agreement, but is the open source software agreement negotiable or not, and how have you handled that?
Good question. Of the 3 data points we have now, I can definitively say that the spirit of this is fast and quick, and to manifest that spirit, there's no negotiation, and also this agreement is not intended to, it's only intended to confirm what the rights of other agreements, like, for example, an open source software license or the rights of a consortium agreement. This is not intended to create kind of its new rights. And so when some of these people we're working with try to put more complex language into it, we really frame, no, that kind of discussion about the rights belongs in either the consortium research agreement or somewhere else. We have these things called participation agreements where if we have non-standard IP terms, then the researchers have to acknowledge that we're using non-standard IP terms as for any resulting IP that results from the research. And so that's where the complexity lies. This OS3 agreement, simple, straightforward, no negotiation.
And Drew, what about for you?
Yeah, from the Michigan standpoint, I would tell you it's actually been refreshing. These conversations go a lot quicker. People are generally, in our experience today, I'll tell you a little bit more shocked than anything when you say, are you willing to do an equity-only agreement? They're kind of like, what are you talking about? And you have to educate them through that process because I think their initial reaction is it's going to be probably burdensome and over the top. And I think it goes right back to this notion of kind of working with your community to kind of say what's fair and reasonable. And, you know, it's the proverbial thing you're trying to do in an equity-based arrangement. I want a small piece of a pie that hopefully gets much, much, much bigger, and trying to be in it for the long haul. So my experience with these agreements is it's been relatively quick, and you know, as long as you're starting at a place that's not out of band and you can have a rational conversation about why your starting point is where it is, then it goes like any other negotiation, with the small exception being I'm not sitting there trying to have a conversation about 5 different points of consideration. It's really 2 things. What's that equity percentage, and then the anti-dilution financing component. So it goes faster.
Great. We still have a lot of questions to go through. Normally we're scheduled for an hour. I think we're going to go for another 10 minutes. And Mike and Drew, are you both able to stay on for another 10 minutes?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, well, we'll keep going. At the end of this, we have a poll, which I think we'll put up in 10 minutes, right? So if you have to drop off early, we also, I think, email out the link to the poll. So if you have to drop off early, we understand, but it'd be great to get your feedback and just respond to the poll link that comes. Mike, there were a bunch of questions around what form of open source license to use. Of which is, again, a whole nother webinar. Do you provide guidance on that? Does it matter to you how they open source?
Yeah, it's a good subtle question, because there again, in the group that helped develop this agreement, some key people, some attorneys and things made a point of saying that this agreement specifies what open source software license is used, but it says it cannot be a license that includes an express patent grant, like the GPL 3.0. So we're trying to thwart that. First of all, we don't recommend anyone use that, and so this agreement is an attempt to help that initiative to not use those kind of. We don't want this to bleed into patents. Okay.
And related to that, do you do any diligence at all when you're deciding whether to grant the license, and how do you decide somebody's in good standing?
Yeah. Well, first of all, one of the caveats that we made, again, everyone's contributing here. We added the phrase "good standing" at the time of this agreement, because we're not going to know what's going on in the future, and that in terms of diligence, one of the things that one of the professors pointed out is this agreement also almost becomes a de facto software disclosure. One of the things that often occurs at Berkeley is that a lot of the software that's open source is never disclosed to our office because they don't see the need to. But now, because we have to kind of describe the software here, it actually is a form of disclosure. And in doing that, we can do a modest amount of diligence to make sure that that we have the rights we're not breaking any rules here, or policies, or laws. And so, but I would say in comparison to a normal license, especially to an exclusive like patent license, the amount of diligence is nominal.
Okay. And Drew, are you handling the diligence process any differently? And also, do you have kind of diligence milestones in your agreements?
We do have diligence milestones, and I think the key thing is because failure to pay, which seems to be a reason for licenses to be brought under discussions about whether they're going to continue or not, isn't really an option for you anymore. Somebody doesn't make a payment. I think it really causes you to think hard about what those diligence milestones are, and really kind of putting I'll call it objectivity test to it. Can you say, definitively, did they meet this milestone or not? So from our standpoint, we do try to focus a little bit more energy on that, and getting really specific about things such as getting products into the marketplace, actually doing releases on a regular basis, all the things that you would hope are happening as far as just general commercial development of the application and the business, so that it succeeds. And that, really revolves around the product, getting the appropriate people on board in order to do it, meeting specific release kind of dates, and then obviously putting feet on the street and making an effort to try and sell the thing. So being super objective about what those criteria might be, I think is very, very important.
Okay, great. And there are one or two questions about kind of the numbers. So Drew, you said you've done 20 licenses of which 8 have been incremental. Over what time period is that?
Yeah, we're almost kind of coming up to about 2 years that we would say it's officially been something we've been out there working on. So it's over a couple of years. Okay.
And we've been informally tracking some numbers around this as well. And I would say Michigan has been the highest volume university in terms of simple software agreements. We've seen a range of numbers. Some universities have used it very rarely, if at all. And so a few universities have said they just haven't found kind of demand for it. Other universities have done quite a few. So there's been a wide range. You know, the number we pay most attention to is how many are incremental, which is hard to really know. But like in Michigan, you know, you commented that 8 of the 20 were incremental, and that's directionally 40 to 50% seem to be incremental, and that seems to be kind of the real value of this. Drew, there was also a question about back on the legal services you provided, the reduced cost legal services. What kind of services are those? It'd be great if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's access to, maybe that's not characterized correctly in that slide, but it's really just kind of getting people pointed towards resources that are either internal on campus. So there's a number of different things that we have, entrepreneurial law clinic and a few other resources that exist on campus where somebody can get some legal help out of our law school. So that's really what that's intended to do. And then certainly we have kind of I'll call it a referral list of attorneys in town that we've worked with that were certainly part of our customer discovery that understand what we're doing, and they're essentially familiar with the agreement, and therefore the actual outlay that you're going to spend in getting that agreement negotiated is profoundly different, because you're not going to come back with a pile of red lines that just are in areas that either we don't have the ability to move on or that don't make any sense. So it's a little bit of a kind of an indirect benefit rather than saying, hey, you're getting a 20% discount. You get the discount as a result of people being familiar with what the agreement structure is and what we're trying to get done.
Okay. And then what, as I want to try, as we kind of wrap up here, I want to try to go to a few higher level questions. There have been a number of kind of deeply technical questions around licenses, like hybrid licensing of companies, both open source and proprietary software. Has it worked? I don't think we're going to be able to get to those today, but we will at the end put up the email addresses of everybody. So if you feel like your question has not been answered, feel free to email us at OUP, or go ahead and email Mike or Drew directly, and we'll try to get anything that goes unanswered answered. But I do want to end with one or two higher level questions. One comes from the audience, which I think is an excellent one, which is, you know, what's the kind of the best argument you would make to a company as to why they should license at all, either through a simple software license or a good standing agreement? So why do it versus continuing to go out the back door? And one person called out, they're not, you know, the non-licensed companies raise just as much per company as the licensed companies. So what's the best argument you would make from a business case standpoint as to why somebody should license from you?
Drew, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think from our standpoint, it's probably a combination of things. It certainly is recognition of the genesis of where this work starts and the support that the university has provided in developing any number of things that certainly may result in being used in the company. Is that a hard and fast benefit that an investor or somebody's going to say that's the particular reason? I don't know if they're going to say that or not. I think certainly the clean bill of health or having that license to present to an investor or someone of that nature, we believe has value. We also believe that having a positive association with the university, some of those benefits such as the brand thing that we talked about, the Powered by Michigan Technology thing and the ability to use that are important. And reputationally, I think it has a lot of benefits to say that it does exist and that there is a formal relationship where the genesis of what you're working on has come from. And we certainly believe all those things to be valuable. And the last thing we would say, and this is maybe a little bit different just based on where we're at, the rising tide truly lifts all boats, and having a positive ecosystem where there's a lot of gain across the board is something that we think everybody benefits from. So participating in a way that we think is reasonable and balanced is something that helps promote that as well.
And what about for you, Mike?
I agree with what Drew said, and maybe just emphasize that a lot of the messaging starts with the faculty leadership, and they all understand that universities such as UC Berkeley, we're always looking to, funding is always a challenge, and they also really understand that there's a lot of wealth creation by the software developed at the university that's open source and then leveraged by spin-outs at the university. They've seen this pattern over time, and they're convinced and happy that we could come up with some kind of win-win agreement, that the university could participate in some of that huge wealth creation and value creation in ways that go back to fund research and education. And by the way, one nuance here is none of this money is going back to the co-authors like would happen in a traditional license. It's going back to the lab, the department, the unit, and the campus. And I think when that message is conveyed, along with the fact that this is optional and there's no cash and all those other nuances, everyone it's kind of a kumbaya thing. It's this is a win-win. Let's try to make this happen. Let's all rally around it. That's kind of the that was the objective, and that's the vision for how this will roll out over time.
And just to add from the investor side, from our side, kind of the clarity of IP ownership is kind of the most critical concrete thing that we do think has value. And so as long as the economics are modest, which in these licenses they are, then it's definitively worthwhile, plus being able to be proud of the university connection. So with that, I think we're going to need to end the webinar. Thank you to Drew and Mike for your incredible contributions to this. It's been really valuable. And thanks to our attendees for participation, for all of the questions, of which there were many. We do apologize if we didn't get to any of your questions. And again, please feel free to go ahead and follow up with us if you didn't. And then now we're going to post, or I think we did just post a link to a poll, a survey. So we learn from everything we do, and we'd like to learn what we could do better. So please go ahead and fill out that poll if you can. And we hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks a lot, Drew and Mike. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye.